Hi, I'm indie fantasy author Melinda Kucsera, and in this episode, Jonathan Weiss is joining me to talk about his book, Blazing Flux. So, welcome, Jonathan, and let's talk about the Blazing Flux. It does not sound pleasant.
No, it's not. Thank you for having me on, Melinda. It's a pleasure
You're
to be
welcome.
back. It's a very evocative title. I think earlier in the kind of in the pre-show when we were chatting, you thought of it as a disease, and I guess kind of in a way it is. But I'll share over the course of this kind of the larger idea of it is this big metaphor for artificial intelligence that's surprisingly relevant to a lot of the things we're seeing with a lot of generative AIs in the world today.
That's cool. So I definitely want to hear all about that. Do you want to talk about that first? Do you want to talk about what the book is about first? Where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, so look, I'll talk what the books are about. So Blazing Flux itself, it is book 2 in the Flux Catastrophe. So that's one of my series that I'm writing. It's set in the Droughtlands. To give you a very brief idea of what kind of world this is, it's basically if you added magic to the world of Mad Max. There's a lot of deserts, a lot of sandstorms, a lot of scrap metal. And the magic itself, what's the part of it that's really stressed upon in this series is this machine-based magic where people can essentially magnetically enchant pieces of metal into these thinking, walking, doing machines at the cost of a piece of their own mind as well. So one of the things that that particular bit of the magic system gets complicated with is that only being able to put so much of your mind into a machine means you can only make a machine so large. But it's with this substance that the people of this world found buried deep within it in the ruins of this other civilization, so much more advanced with them, a substance called molten flux, that they've actually been able to expand that power. And this is where it starts to get a bit grisly, right? They put the molten flux, this weird, ever-expanding liquid metal, into any kind of fresh corpses they find, and it almost semi-resurrects them. And it has this corpse that they call an automind act as this extra brain for them to control these machines with. So the more autominds you have, the larger a machine you can control. But then it comes to the question, what do you do when you run out of corpses? Well, you have to go find some more, right?
Yeah, that's not a question that one has to worry about in their everyday life usually.
Thankfully not.
Yeah,
No.
that's a unique problem.
Very unique problem. And so, this world's been really stricken by this odd hyper-capitalism that's driven by this need to have larger and larger machines, larger and larger factories controlled by these autominds, and the human cost that comes to create these awful places. So that's where in first book, Molten Flux, the walking fortress of Revance comes in. It's this enormous monstrosity of scrap metal that is controlled by, well, actually the mercenary army aboard it. They don't actually know what it's controlled by. They know it's not autominds, but they don't know what it actually is. But they do use that as their base of operations for trying to wipe out the people who are creating these autominds. They're called smelters to them, right? And so while they're doing that, it's almost this losing battle because the world they're trying to stomp out is also the world that and all the factories, that's the thing that's arming them, that's the thing that's giving them their supplies. So it's almost this kind of self-cannibalizing type of war economy. So as they keep trying to stomp it out, there comes inside it inside the fortress, the attempts of a mutiny to actually turn over the army and the fortress to the smelters to better aid them instead. And it's not much of a spoiler to say the protagonist's efforts in the first book, Ryza is his name, his efforts to stop it go very poorly, which leads to Blazing Flux, which is the second book, which involves the cleanup of this enormous, destroyed, torn apart version of Revance that's just lying there dead in the middle of this big valley. It's absolutely stricken. It is infested with massive pools of molten flux, more than anyone has ever seen before. And Ryza and the rest of the remaining surviving conscripts are trying to clean this up because they know that if anyone gets to this massive bounty of flux and corpses from the battle and scrap metal, they'll be able to make gargantuan machines from it. So they need to stop this. And so to get a bit more into the inspirations behind this second book, behind Blazing Flux, a lot of it comes from the Chernobyl disasters cleanup efforts. So
Really?
I'm sure everyone's heard about the Chernobyl nuclear power plant meltdown in 1986. It pretty much bankrupted the Soviet Union to try and clean this thing up. If you've watched the HBO miniseries they did on it, it was a bit of a dramatization of it. You'll see these absolutely Herculean efforts they go through to try and clean up this never seen before disaster. All this radiation, all this superheated, super dangerous radioactive waste that at one point pretty much turns into lava that's threatening to melt through the earth. So they have to dig under it to build this concrete slab under it. Just those kinds of terrifying, world-destroying stakes against this danger that you can't really talk to and you can't really reason with. It's just there and you have to deal with it. That's what inspired a lot of Blazing Flux to start with, because I'm just obsessed with that kind of nuclear disaster, because it's not something that you can really deal with properly. You can't see it, you can't touch it without, being strongly affected yourself.
No, and if you don't even know, unless you're like wandering around with like a radiation meter or something, you don't even know you've been exposed. Like
Exactly.
I grew up within within the 10-mile danger zone of like a nuclear power plant in where I live in New York, and like I grew up with like these poles with these like alarms, and they'd test them a couple of times a year, and it'd be like kind of scary, like, well, what if this was real? What if we had to evacuate? Like, you can't see radiation, you wouldn't know,
Exactly.
You just start getting like and the symptoms from like radiation sickness are like, they're kind of scary. The later stages.
Once they start, cannot, like, you're locked in for that. That's it.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Once you've been exposed, that's it. It's a ticking clock. And like some of the early symptoms don't, like, you wouldn't know necessarily, what it is until like your skin starts falling off, and like, things that don't normally happen when you're getting sick start happening. Like, it's
already way too late.
Yeah. I got a question for you. So what do these people do when they die to ensure that they don't become corpses that then become reanimated? Like, do they have some kind of practice or or do they just accept that like when they become a corpse, they may be recycled and reanimated?
Yeah. That's it. I mean, it's something that doesn't really get touched on too much because there's already too much in the book there to cover, but it's definitely something I'll think about. It is something where the ideology of the smelters actually comes into play. They only tend to want a fresh corpse, right? And this is actually something that comes into what I'll talk about with molten flux as well. You want a fresh corpse that's intact. Otherwise, the flux itself leaks out, and much like radioactive material, it's deadly to touch. If you touch the molten flux, it gets in through your pores, and that'll slowly turn you into an automind as well. It'll take your life and your mind, and then you'll just be another one of those things. So when you're dealing with autominds, you want fresh, intact corpses. So the idea is, as long as they don't get to you too quickly, your body will be fine. But a lot of people don't really have that privilege because it's like I said before, there's a lot of smelters out there answering the question, what do you do when you run out of corpses?
Yeah. I guess you stop having choices and you're like, well, this one's not a freshie, but we'll just pretend that he is.
That's it. That's exactly it.
Oh, wow. But like, what about people who are like, there's in every society, there are those who are rich or better off than everybody else. Do they like,
they're fine.
Do they have people who like mutilate their corpses afterwards or put them somewhere that you can't get to?
They usually do. Yeah.
Okay. So there's
they're fine, but I don't really focus too much on the rich of this story because I'm
just curious.
Guys, the ones who made their money through all these factories.
I'm just curious because like, like is so there is like an escape from being part of that if you don't want to be.
Yeah, effectively, you just have to have enough money to be able to escape it.
Yeah, and I guess people who are going to help you, because once you're dead, you can't exactly do anything.
Not really, no.
And these auto mines don't like once you're dead, like you don't, and you brought back as an auto
Exactly,
mine,
yeah.
you don't remember anything about your previous life or have any sort of like autonomy or independent thought.
Exactly, yeah. So they're effectively they're resurrected bodies, but they're not resurrected minds.
Gotcha.
That's why they're so useful, because they are empty minds to be able to control those machines that have been created as well.
That's wild. All right, what were you gonna
Yeah.
say before I like went off on this like tangent?
Oh, it's a good tangent. So I think I was going to talk about how I think we'll talk about now how the molten flux itself, how it
Yes.
compares and kind of mirrors what you see in artificial intelligence as well. And I can take a little bit of a tangent here to talk about
Sure.
artificial intelligence. I did a bit of research into it. And by bit, I mean, I spent a lot of time on it as well. I talked to a couple of friends who are actually working in that field.
Okay.
Um, to briefly say what artificial intelligence is, it's at least like, the generative kind we're seeing a lot with ChatGPT and DALI and all those other kind of image or text or even video generators now. It's essentially just probability and numbers. So when you have a look at what AI is, it's not actually kind of creating anything. It's just trying to create what you're expecting to see by the data sets you've fed into it. This is why artificial intelligence is really good at recognizing and creating patterns. There's really cool videos about how like kind of shape and facial recognition is used with AI vision cameras to be able to like count sheep as they go into a field or see how people move about in a public space to better kind of dictate their flow. Artificial intelligence is great for that. It's great for seeing stuff that happens over and over again and recognizing those patterns in like these enormous kind of sets of data that it gets fed. What artificial intelligence isn't really great at is creating new stuff. This is
No. Yeah.
because how you kind of train artificial intelligence is by giving it a whole bunch of stuff that already exists and then say kind of asking it to categorize that stuff. So if I was going to have an artificial intelligence recognize the difference between cats and dogs, I can't just give it kind of a series of text instructions to say a cat has this shaped ears, a dog has that shaped ears, and have it make those decisions, because it's not really going to be able to figure that out from a picture. So you feed it millions of pictures of cats and millions of pictures of dogs, and then it'll use those things. It'll kind of translate those into a whole bunch of series of numbers effectively in its brain, to put it really simply. And then when you feed it a new picture, asking it to recognize it of a cat or a dog, it'll translate that picture and compare it to the data sets that it has and figure it out. The problem comes if you put in a picture of a giraffe, because it's not going to recognize a giraffe. It doesn't have that kind of data. It'll say this is more percentage cat than dog or dog than cat, and it'll give you that result. So that's why, like, you have a thing called machine learning. So when your artificial intelligences are being introduced to new data, they will have another mechanism in them that will determine if the answer that they give for recognizing it is right or wrong. So when you're, let's go back to the cat and dog AI, right? If you keep feeding cats and dogs into it, obviously each time it successfully recognizes a cat, it'll go, great, we're going to keep recognizing that kind of thing as a cat. And it'll get better at recognizing those things. So to expand that out to kind of all things it's looking at, every time it looks at something, it'll kind of database that and process that, which is, why a lot of authors are worried about the entire internet being scraped for AI training purposes, because it turns out our books are probably going to be included in that. And so when you have artificial intelligence start generating stuff, it's basically looking into its archives of data, comparing the requests that you put in, and then creating kind of in its head its own string of numbers to match the data sets it's already had, and then translating that into what you want to see. So that's why, it can create let's say, a really good picture of Joe Biden, for instance, because there's millions upon millions of pictures of him, because he's the president of the United States. Everyone's taking pictures of him every day. They're everywhere. But if it was asked to create a picture of me, for instance, it wouldn't really be able to do that too well, because there's not nearly as many pictures of me. At least I hope not yet.
That's true.
Hopefully one day, be big and famous like that.
But they are scraping all of our pictures from social media and stuff. So our profile pictures and all that all those pictures you snapped when you were out drinking in college might be somewhere in the model.
That's it. Yeah. So that stuff is out there, but it's not exact, which is a bit unfortunate. So basically, when it's giving you all this stuff, it'll look pretty good if it's got enough training data, but it won't look perfect, because at the end of the day, it's still kind of taking these very, very calculated guesses. It's a very defined piece of probability. My friend who is into AI, they showed me some of the stats and the maths behind it, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it, obviously. Like, it's just crazy what's kind of going on behind the scenes, which is why, like, if I see a lot of people claiming to be an expert on artificial intelligence and that it's going to take over everything in the next 3 or 5 years, I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't believe them, because I don't think they're kind of recognizing it as a probability-based thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a side thing, right? So when you're kind of moving towards what molten flux is, it's this ancient, super advanced, self-replicating metal liquid that's just filled with these nanomachines that are driven by this kind of AI. So every time they see a person, they kind of take its impressions, read their mind effectively, let's leave the technology side of how you read minds aside, because it's super advanced at that point, and use that person's impressions of what it should be as molten flux to change its behavior. The molten flux's imperative that's given to it by its creator is simple. It's to want as they want, which kind of goes on a couple different layers. On kind of our mental layer, it's to make the molten flux behave as we expect it to behave. On a physiological level, it's looking at our cells and seeing that kind of will to live, that constant drive to divide and expand and continue growing. And so that's why the liquid metal it's hosted in continues to self-replicate. It's why when it gets injected into a body, it sees all the cells around it, fills the body and tries to replicate it, and kind of creates those autominds, those half-living people. But there comes a couple problems. What do you do if the molten flux doesn't have enough data? If there's too much of it in one place and only one person have an impression of it, it won't behave as everyone expects to behave. The only reason that the molten flux basically turns people into autominds, and the only reason why it's still kind of quote unquote stable, is because everyone who's viewing it, the entire society and the entire economy that's built upon the back of it, is expecting it to behave in a particular way. They're expecting it to create autominds, and that's it. But the problem that you have that really starts to appear in Blazing Flux, the second book, once Revance is gone, there's molten flux everywhere, and there's not enough people to clean it up. There's too much flux and not enough impressions. It's never seen before territory, and the people cleaning it up believe that anything can happen with the flux, and so it does, right? There's some really fun moments in the book where the flux starts hallucinating, like you see generative AIs hallucinating when they're creating images where people have too many fingers, a building will have too many doors in places that you can't actually reach, right? All that kind of stuff starts happening because
or extra legs.
People, yeah, exactly, right.
Those are my favorite for some reason.
They're so funny.
I saw one where I think he was supposed to be Jesus, and like Jesus had like 3 legs coming out of his chest draped over his arm, and like there was a bus behind him that said JE space SUS on the top, where it usually has like the where is the destination, and then it was a girl, and he he was holding her hand with the hand that was not holding his 3 legs. And he had 2 regular legs that he was running
Oh,
through water. And I was like, well, this clearly can't be Jesus. He's not walking on water. It is the wildest picture. I saw it on Twitter the other day because apparently, like, Facebook and maybe Twitter too at this point were flooded with AI images of Jesus, shrimp Jesus,
that's
and
so good.
Pepsi can Jesus, and this monstrosity. And I just stared at it for way too long trying to make sense
So
out of
good.
it.
Yeah, it's a slight tangent. I'm generally against generative AI being used as an end product or as a means to create things, except for funny stuff like that. It's
Yeah.
too good.
That's
Because like no one's
yeah.
actually going to sit down and draw that. No one's going to think of that. I love the
No.
hallucinations that artificial intelligence makes. I think that artificial intelligence isn't able to create art unless it's hallucinating thoroughly, which I think is hilarious.
Which is pretty fun, right? Like there was that
Yeah.
book, like was it Do Electric Sheep Dream or something? I forgot the
Do
exact
androids
title.
dream of
That's
electric
it.
sheep turned
I
into
I
Blade Runner?
I always like
Yeah,
slaughter the title of that. It was a great book.
yeah.
But yeah, every time they hallucinate, I'm reminded of that title, and my brain slaughters the title every time. I hallucinate wild versions of the title
Different
because I
ways to
can
make the
never
title.
remember
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
But yeah,
Oh,
no, I love the
hilarious.
hallucinations too because if a real human artist made that, like they'd get slammed from left, right, and center. But the AI doesn't. Like, well, the AI doesn't know any
Too
better.
absurd. It's too
it
absurd.
doesn't.
It's great.
It doesn't know we don't have 5 legs.
It doesn't
Legs
know that
are
Jesus
hard.
didn't see a bus in his time.
Yeah, like it doesn't know. And there's some like
Yeah,
there's like people in the bus, but they're so horribly disfigured. I didn't understand what passengers in a bus look like. They're very
yeah,
blocky. They're either people or there's just a lot of boxes
yeah.
in flesh and colored. Yeah, it's wild.
Shapes. Yeah,
Um,
it's terrifying. It's great.
yeah,
It's great and terrifying. But yeah, like, I
yeah.
mean, that
Go
goes back
on.
to my point, right? The AI
Yeah.
can't like at least these days, like these generative AIs, they'll get more accurate as time goes on, but there'll still be little imperfections and stuff, and it'll never quite be right because it's still always taking those guesses at it, and that back to the kind of thing in Blazing Flux here, the all the molten flux is trying to take guesses at what it should be, and this is where the defense mechanisms come in that have been built into molten flux as kind of a creation, right? The first is that obviously it only reads the living, so it won't kind of take impressions from a corpse. It won't take impressions from inert objects. So this keeps it safe from doing things that are unexpected generally.
Mhm.
The second thing is the blazing flux itself. So one of the lesser known traits to the people who are these smelters, people who are working with molten flux to create all these auto mines, is they know that if you get too much molten flux in one place, it explodes in a very volatile way into this gaseous form that they call blazing flux. It disperses into the air, and obviously if
Oh,
you're around that and you breathe that in, that's not good for you. It's a massive hazard. So
what
if
does
you
it
have
do to you? Or is that a spoiler?
it
We have to
turns you
wait for
into
the
an
book.
auto mind in the worst way possible.
Oh
It
no,
gets into your lungs and then just infests you. It's horrifying.
that sounds kind of like the techno-organic virus of like the Marvel Comics universe, which
Yeah.
Cable suffered. I love Cable, so and he suffered
Yes.
from that weird disease that my teenage self could not wrap my brain around.
Yeah.
But
So
now
yeah,
listening to you, I kind of I now I can wrap my brain
you can kind
around
of
it. So,
picture it, right? Like just imagine
yeah,
every cell in
yeah,
your body being replaced by this
yeah,
guesswork of what it should be.
yeah. Go on, but I just
Yeah.
that connection fired in the
It's a
brain, and
good
I was
connection,
like,
right?
yeah, and I'm like, this is a fantasy podcast, so somebody else out there might be a Marvel fan and might be familiar with Cable, and maybe that connection
Yeah.
can help them connect with Blazing Flux.
Totally. No, I mean, Cable's awesome. So like I'm totally
Yeah,
down for that.
yeah.
Anyway, so don't be around too much flux. Don't get too much of it in one place, and don't fill the wreckage of a giant walking fortress with enormous pools, if not lakes, of blazing flux. The question that Ryza, as he's trying to clean all this up, has for himself is why hasn't all this flux blazed yet? There's too much of it. Why isn't it doing it? And the answer, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler. I hope it's not. He eventually arrives at kind of as he understands the
Mm.
what the molten flux actually is. It's because no one's actually expecting it to blaze. There's simply too much of it for them to comprehend it turning into that. And obviously, once he has that thought, the molten flux catches onto that and starts blazing as well. So that's very bad. But that's one of the defense mechanisms. It gets itself dispersed. It finds new ideas by being in the air, and it finds new people to take impressions of. After that, it starts to settle down a bit, but it's too late. The damage is already done. The stuff's everywhere. That's bad. These defense mechanisms are all well and good until the people of the world started to mess around with the flux. They saw the way that it could sustain life, if only as a mimic of life, right, in the auto mines. But they figured, what if it could sustain me forever? What if I could take it into my body and I could control the machines that are in the flux? Because remember, these are magic systems about controlling machines. The flux is full of machines. What if they controlled them as well? And so it's never quite clear if those who did it, who took flux into their bodies and tried to control it, still controlled it, or if the flux inhabiting their bodies is essentially using them as an unwitting puppet that still thinks it's controlling it. Because they always have that impression that I am in the flux, I control the flux, but they never quite ask the question if the flux is controlling them, if it's using them as a puppet, if they're only an image created by the flux because they themselves expected to live on in the flux, right? So the problem here is that now you have a person who thinks they're living, who's made of flux, and the flux sees them and sees a living person and takes impressions of them, but it's the flux reading itself. It's taking impressions of a living thing that's actually made of flux. And to go back to what generative AI suffers with is when it's looking at other AI generated images, it'll actually take on that data set, which has already been used and recycled, and it'll actually start to corrupt itself. You'll see AI scientists talk about how you can't just scrape the entire internet to make AI's data set anymore, because there's so much AI stuff already pumped out there. So the hallucinations that the flux will make will get worse when it's got more and more of this impression of itself that's taking itself. The same way those AIs get worse as they see more and more hallucinatory images, because they can't really tell what's real or not. They're just seeing what's in the data set, right?
They don't know what a leg is.
They don't know you're not meant to have three of them spouting out of your chest, right?
Exactly. And that's what made that creepy image, like, that's why I couldn't stop staring at it, because it was like, I like, even out of like,
how they get it.
Yeah, because like, even if you look at like horror images and stuff, like, that's not normally like the way, you know what I mean? Like, if a human was to create some kind of like wild, horrific image, like, they would go in other directions, more like Matrix, or like, machine parts coming out of us, not extra legs.
Just extra legs, just for no reason.
Or like that, or like Metamorphosis by like Kafka, where like you turn into an insect, because who doesn't find insects horrifying? Like, that's where our brains go. Or you turn into a sandworm, a la Book 4, God Emperor of Dune. And I'm sorry if I'm spoiling that for people, but that book is so wild. Yeah, any internet search, and you would like that scene where his consciousness, like that, that's probably my favorite scene in that entire book was when he fully becomes the sandworm, and his consciousness, like, it's like described like it's like this glowing pearl inside the Anyways, that book was a mind trip. But that's where we go as humans. But the AIs, like, they have their own version of creepypasta.
It's not bound to making sense the same way that we are.
And I think that's what makes it fun. And like the fact that the internet is so saturated by it that now they can't scrape anymore is kind of pretty fun. And like there are some authors and even some artists that are now embracing AI. So like eventually you won't even you won't even be able to scrape anything, because everything might have some AI in it. So like, it just makes you wonder, like, where can we go from here and how?
Well, we might just have to get around, have a good talk, and maybe stop doing this crazy kind of stuff, because it turns out we've just polluted the internet. We've ruined it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's funny.
But in the meantime, we'll have
sorry.
we'll have strange,
We'll have Jesus with
images.
5 legs.
Yeah, and like the hallucinations are fun.
They are fun, yeah.
So yeah, and I do have to say, like, one good thing about AI is, like, if you have to process data, like if you have a format that you need, and you have and you've had people fill out a form, and you need to get the stuff that they filled out in the form into this format, and you don't want to sit there and do all that cutting and pasting, because that's really horrible for your carpals, your like wrists, your hands, like just you as a person, because it's mind numbing. You just paste that in, and the AIs don't care. They don't know that this is boring.
Yeah.
And they're not really cutting and pasting, they're regurgitating what you gave them in the template you wanted. So like, I do have to say, like, that's one of the best parts of AI, is that you can hand them these really horribly mind numbing things. You just paste it in, ask them, and they spit it out, you copy, paste, done.
AI usage, yeah.
Yeah.
I just worry about the people who want AI to replace the good parts of life,
Yeah.
And they're the ones that we got to keep an eye on. They're the ones we got to worry about. And I think, look, I mean, that's a lot of the driving force behind the Flux Catastrophe books. It's the people who want to make this money at all costs. I do firmly believe if in real life, if someone did find a way to make something like an AutoMind, someone would be trying to make a startup out of it that's called like AutoMind R, with no E between the D and the R at the end. They'd try it, and that's the kind of thing I worry about for people. So take all these books as a cautionary tale. I don't endorse what happens in them. Don't do that.
Well, I mean, didn't Elon Musk have that neural link or something where he was gonna? I don't know why anybody would trust him to put anything in their brain. That just seems like a recipe of disaster.
I wouldn't trust him specifically. I think one of the worst things about Elon Musk is he's gulped up the credit and credibility of a great number of engineers and scientists and inventors to pretend that he created these things.
Yeah.
I don't think he knows about what, he doesn't know the specifics about how a Neuralink works. I don't think he created those things. He just bought the company.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's not talk about him, because the internet has enough of it on it.
Definitely.
I think I'll talk about. I just want to go back to kind of those hallucinations and stuff, because they were very fun to write, and I actually had to really sit down with myself to try and figure out how do I, as a human being, create those AI-like hallucinations, because it turns out that's one thing I can't do with my own mind, because I was trying to force everything to make sense. So yeah, it took a while, but if you do end up reading Blazing Flux, I think there's a lot of scenes in there that do look very similar to those kinds of hallucinations. It's a great deal of fun as well.
No, it is. I love the hallucinations. They're just, you never know what you're going to get there.
Yeah.
Sometimes I just put stuff in just because I want them to hallucinate things. And you're bored.
Fun. Yeah.
Don't scroll through social media. Get the AIs to hallucinate.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if there'll come a day where you can get a social media feed that's just entirely concocted by an AI, just because you don't actually want to look at real life,
I mean, there are some services out there where you can like just interact with an AI chatbot, and some of them are, I mean, some of them are benign, meant to be benign. Whether they are or not is debatable. Some of them are meant for X-rated purposes.
That's a problem.
Which is always the difficulty when you have new technology, is that somebody will use it for things that many of us would not like to see.
Yeah.
You get the good and the scary. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cool.
Do you want to go on?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to offer to
Sure.
just read the first chapter of Molten Flux. I've been talking for half an hour. I haven't even read a bit of the book, which I know is a bit of a departure from your standard format. It's usually the reading at the start, right? But I just wanted to tell
Uh,
you about kind of all the stuff that builds up into this world.
Yeah, not exactly. We've had some historical fiction, fantasy authors, and a couple other people where like the research was, and they talked about that first because it was interesting.
Mm,
Especially like the historical fiction. So
mm.
like it's just wherever it naturally falls, and sometimes there needs to be some discussion first. Sometimes there doesn't. Like it's really up to the individual author. They know their book babies best.
Yeah, well, I hope I know mine best.
We hope so.
I've
All right, let's do the
let's do
excerpt.
it. Okay, so I'm going to read just chapter 1 of Molten Flux, which is the first book. So it's the start of Ryza's adventure, just before he gets conscripted onto the Walking Fortress of Revance, because it gives you a great impression of the world itself, the action that you're going to find within these books. Because there's a lot of I wrote these books specifically for the battles and the fights and stuff that happen in these worlds, because the other series I write just can't quite hold that sometimes. But anyway, I'll launch into it. Okay. Chapter 1, Canyon Captives. Ryza could taste sand at one corner of his lips and blood at the other. He glanced at the man who'd just struck him. He was shirtless, scarred, and covered in filth. Typical smelter. The man brandished his scrap club at Ryza, threatening another blow if he didn't get moving. In order to avoid being knocked senseless, he bitterly obeyed. Ryza's gift from the smelter was a set of box-like cuffs that bound his wrists, sharp wire biting into his skin. The blood running down his temple made his cropped hair redder than usual. The smelter that had cuffed him shouted something guttural and shoved Ryza into the line of similarly restrained men. Walls of red rock reached high on either side, the last signs of daylight brushing over the cliff's edge. The sky had been blue when their trade caravan had entered the canyon, now was a bruised purple. In hindsight, the decision to travel this route was extremely foolish. They'd been halfway through when a single man holding a dagger had stepped from the shadows and brought the whole procession to a grinding halt. Smelters had appeared in front and behind them, 10 in total, all with makeshift weapons in one hand, a bag of cuffs in the other, and a hungry grin on their faces. The line of docile merchants scrambled forward and Ryza moved with them. Leaning to his right, he could see what was happening at the front. Each man's cuffs were being threaded with a long length of chain before the chain was passed to the next prisoner. Ryza looked down at his restraints. It was a small square of thick metal, with a slot on each side for his wrist to be bound by a thick wire. In the middle, a small hole had been drilled for the chain to be passed through. The damn thing was more rust than iron, but no matter how much Ryza struggled against it, he couldn't break free on his own. The smelter with the chain slapped the man he was attending to on the back of the head, sending him stumbling into the group of the restrained traders, then beckoned to the next man. The line shambled forwards. Ryza was now next to the caravan's carts. 3 men with crowbars busted them open with glee and rummaged around, looting anything they perceived as valuable. Sacks of reels, bundled furs, glinting jewels, and most importantly, water. Legend had it people once drank the precious stuff, eons ago when it still rained in this desert land. But one day, people just stopped needing to. It was all in the air. Now water was scarce, used only for the concoction of magical inks that would be painted into runes onto the skin, where their meaning could be cast as axioms into the world. Axioms that could set him free. He looked down at his wrists. One blocky green rune peeked out from under the restraints. This one could manipulate the magnetism of a piece of metal if he was touching it, enough to break him out of these damn cuffs. In his mind, he could picture the metal wires holding his wrists snapping like twine. But what would he do? Get beaten to death by 10 smelters, most likely. But at least he would die a free man. There was a small vial of green ink stashed in his underpants, but by the time he had painted another rune on his arm, his head would be inside out. The line shuffled forwards again. There were only 3 people in front of him. He needed a plan, fast. Unconsciously, he began chewing his top lip. He'd done this ever since he was small. It just seemed to help him think. Ryza could still remember when his father had taught him that some animals could be instantly calmed by holding their upper lip. Maybe he was right about that, but he'd also been wrong about a whole lot else. The chain had pulled the next man into position. 2 left until it was Ryza's turn. He glanced around quickly. There was no way he could outrun the smelters. He might be fast and lean, but they would catch up to him before he made it out of the canyon. No matter which direction he chose, there would be at least a mile until he hit open desert. That wasn't an option. The cliff walls would be working against him. But what if he could use them? His train of thought was interrupted by a shout from the caravan's half-looted carts. Water! Whoops of delight echoed through the canyon, and the smelters swarmed to it. The caravan had set out with an entire bucket of water, enough to trade for a town's worth of reals. Now it would just go to waste in the hands of these wretches. Ryza didn't care. They could have it. That bucket of water may have just bought him his escape. 3 men ran past him from the front. 4 men were already at the carts. Ryza looked over his shoulder. Having run out of cuffs, the smelter that had all but concussed him was idly standing guard at the back of the halted convoy. There were now only 3 men he needed to get past. The chainer, the smelter corralling the chained merchants, and the man who had stopped the caravan in the first place, who was standing about 20 meters away and playing with his pathetically small dagger. The chainer paused for a moment at the commotion, but was now turned back to the man in front of him. Ryza watched his every motion closely. First, the chainer placed his club down, leaning it against his leg as he fumbled the excessively long iron coil through the cuffs. Once that was done, the man in question received a quick tap from the club to move him along. The whole process took maybe a minute at best. The man ahead of Ryza stepped forward and he followed. If he could pop the cuffs off fast enough, he could get to the club before the chainer could grab it. Then he'd have to dart back to avoid being grabbed. The chainer would still have that length of chain to swing with, but that wasn't a match for the vicious-looking weapon. The only problem would be that Ryza would have to fight the other man at the same time. Even if he could dispatch both, the rest of the smelters would be on him. Cuffs, the chainer grunted at the man ahead, placing down his club and holding out his hand. But the man hesitated. Ryza watched his shoulders tense. Maybe he was thinking of an escape too. Ryza swore under his breath. It didn't matter if this man made it out or not. Ryza's plan was now ruined. Cuffs, the chainer demanded. You can have them, the man roared. He followed through with a vicious uppercut, aiming the edge of the cuffs at the chainer's chin. But the chainer was quicker, deftly dodging the blow with a step back, scooping up his club as he went. One swing would have been enough to put the man in his place, but the chainer seemed to think a bit more discipline was needed. Each lumbering blow came crashing down on the man's skull, cracking into bone before squelching through brain, sending an explosive burst of blood and giblets in every direction. By the time the man's lifeless corpse collapsed, both Ryza and the chainer were covered in blood. Ryza could feel the warmth of it soaking through his shirt. He could feel his breathing quicken. If that was the result of a failed plan, he might as well ask to be clubbed too. The nearest smelter approached him, giving the body a light kick and grunting. Bit of a mess there, he said to the chainer. The chainer croaked with laughter. You're telling me? A bit of flux ain't fixing that. He turned to Ryza and offered him a toothless grin. Sorry about the mess. Looks like we'll both be filthy for a week. Ryza shuddered at the thought. Packed in a cage with the others while covered in a dead man's blood. He'd rather die. They'd kill him anyway once they were ready, only to pump his corpse full of molten flux and make it walk once more. It's how the bastards got the name Smelter in the first place. Ryza shuddered again. The silver substance was unnerving enough to look at in a glass vial. He couldn't imagine it coursing through his veins. The chainer beckoned him forward, but Ryza hesitated. The chainer still hadn't put down his club. He glanced over at the other smelter. He was too close. Ryza could attack the chainer, but the other man would be on him before he was out of the cuffs. The smelter moved closer, his shoulder almost bumping against Ryza's. Wouldn't be thinking about doing the same now, would you? Ryza resisted wincing as the man's breath engulfed his face. The scent of long-rotted meat. I've got enough blood on me for one day, Ryza said, struggling to keep his voice level. The smelter and the chainer cackled, throwing their heads back. Ryza glanced over his shoulder while they were distracted. None of the other smelters had noticed the commotion. They were still too busy with the looted cart. The chainer moved closer, his left shoulder just next to Ryza's right. You're a funny one. I always liked that in an auto mind, the chainer said. Hopefully the flux can bring that back with you. The chainer placed down his club, resting it against his right knee, and Ryza swore inwardly. The chainer and the smelter were facing each other in front of him. They'd have him by the neck by the time he could dive for the weapon. Ryza glanced at the smelter on his left. He was holding his own club loosely in his right hand. If he could just get to it first. Ryza began concentrating on the rune inked onto his left wrist, imagining it sliding into his clenched fist, almost hearing the loud ping of the cuffs that. No, sorry, let me start again. Almost hearing the loud ping the cuffs would make as the wire snapped out with deadly force. Ryza's eyes widened. That was it. Now let's not have any more trouble here. Let's see them cuffs. Of course, Ryza said with a grin. He whipped them up to neck level and clamped his eyes shut, forcing the rune onto his hand to burn white hot. To feel the metal, become the metal, revel in it. His father's words ran through his head as an ethereal feeling flowed into the wire, as if it were an extension of his hands. It was his to control. The wire whipped through the air and Ryza's fist flew apart, bursting out of the cuffs and slamming into the faces of the men on either side. It would have been a stunning blow to each of them, enough to send them staggering back, roaring in pain. But when Ryza opened his eyes, it was to a gurgling silence. His fists were drenched in blood. On the other side of him, the men were clutching at his throats, metal wire embedded in each of their necks. Ryza couldn't believe his luck. That's what they get for giving a Cretatic enough metal. The club was in Ryza's hands before the chain's body hit the ground, and he sprinted at the Smelter still playing with his dagger. They only looked up when Ryza was 2 paces away, but it was far too late for him. Ryza made a wide, one-handed swing with the club that would devastate whatever it hit. The blow landed right in the center of the man's face, the weighty club head caving in his skull with ease. They collapsed into the dust, but Ryza had already sprinted on. He was scanning the cliff walls as he fled, looking for that one bit of extra rocky surface that he could scramble up. As a child, he climbed and subsequently fallen off enough things that he considered himself as nimble on a wall as he was on the ground. He only had to hope the smelters weren't similarly gifted, and that they didn't find the crates of pristine rifles hidden in the rear carts. A shout of alarm filled the canyon behind him. The smelters had caught on, but it didn't matter. Ryza was already a good 200 meters away from them, and he'd found exactly what he was looking for. On one side of the cliff, it creased into the wall, just enough to form a narrow rocky shaft that went all the way to the top. Ryza began climbing it with ease, finding handholds and footholds without even looking. It was only when he was halfway up that he looked down and realized how much blood was on his hands. At least it wasn't his. Not yet. Down below, the remaining smelters had caught up to him. Some of what they were shouting at him might have been words, but Ryza wasn't focused on them. If he turned to yell at them, if he got cocky, he might as well just let go and fall to his death. However, his focus shook as a loud clang came from somewhere below. One of the smelters hurled a freshly pillaged rifle at him, the improvised javelin only making it halfway up the cliff before clattering back down harmlessly. The idea caught on, and soon all 7 of them were hurling their own clubs and machetes at Ryza, none of them coming nearly high enough to hit him. He allowed himself a smirk, but it was wiped off his face when a dagger bounced off the piece of rock he was about to put his hand on. He scrambled higher, a little faster than what he was comfortable with, but soon he was clambering over the edge of the cliff. There was no chance of the smelters following, and by the time they reached the top, Ryza would be long gone. He looked to his right at the now unattended caravan. The few men that hadn't been cuffed were now attempting to unchain the rest. Now they worked together. Ryza hadn't heard a single friendly word for the 2 weeks since the caravan had left Brugessa. Every single person down there had been out to make their own fortune. He hadn't even learnt any of their names because how little they spoke of anything that wasn't reals. At least they weren't trading in molten flux. They could fend for themselves now. They would probably be recaptured once the remaining smelters realized what was going on. But Ryza was free. All he had to do was find the next trading post and hitch a ride. Ryza turned around, ready to set off west, but was met with a sight that made his jaw drop. There was no horizon. Instead, all he could see was a tumultuous wall of sand, as high as the sky itself. It was rapidly bearing down on him, sucking up the dunes as fuel. Ryza could feel the oncoming gusts on his tongue. This one would be vicious, more vicious than the smelters down below. Suddenly, the canyon was looking mighty inviting. Ryza swore to himself. He needed shelter. A cave would be perfect, but as he scanned the land, the only thing he saw was a rocky outcrop. He looked back up at the sandstorm. It seemed to have doubled in size in the time he hadn't been watching it. Enormous dark shapes were shifting in the belly of the thrashing haze. Ryza began sprinting again, almost losing control of his legs as he bolted down the sandy slope for the rocks. Before, it had been a simple race against the wits of some smelters, but now he's competing with the fury of the desert itself. If he hadn't secreted himself among those rocks by the time the storm hit, he'd be flung sky high by the howling wind. Ryza could feel it pushing against him, slowing down his stride as the dunes began to shift under his feet. He was almost there, but the sandstorm was closer. The rocks disappeared in an instant, but Ryza kept running. The wall of dust was now upon him, stretching over him like a monster's jaw, tendrils of sand reaching out for him. Ryza burst into it. He felt his feet leave the ground. And that's chapter 1.
I'm never ready for a 10. I'm always like scrambling to find the unmute button.
Oh, yeah.
In every podcast. I would have missed the clue. Oh. I love listening to authors read their works. I get so lost in listening that the clue would have just flown right past me.
Oh, I'll tell you what, I don't know how audiobook narrators do it, because I feel myself getting caught on my words as well. Like there was a time where I thought about doing my own audiobook, but it's a skill.
I mean, I think they probably, like, I did actually narrate one of my shorter works, and it was really hard. There was a lot of re-recording. I hated my voice. I hated the whole project by the end. But listening to it months later, it sounded good. I mean, there's places where it could have been better, but I'm also not. This was like the first time I ever tried anything like this, and hopefully, like, listeners are a little more forgiving, knowing that I'm an author, not a narrator.
Not an audio. Yeah,
this was exactly. This was like a special thing, and like, yeah. Well, it's only available on my website. It's not on Audible or anything. Yeah, I was like just not confident enough to put it on there. So it was So, but yeah, wow. That was quite the excerpt.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I think I wanted to read that one rather than anything from Blazing Flux, because obviously reading something from a sequel without the context of the original, usually a bit hard to kind of get to grips with, but B, because that was out of all the kind of parts of Molten Flux, over the many years that I had to write it, that first chapter was the one that remained the most unchanged, because I don't know, I just felt like I had it so right the first time.
It's a good first chapter.
Thank you.
I mean, it's and you read it on here before too, and like I was like it was still, even though I should know what happens, I'd forgotten. So it's still
chapter the first time, but I read you the Hythera Redux.
Oh, that's right. It was a different book. Okay, because it was like, I was like, well, I've also listened to audiobooks that I've listened to before and didn't realize till like some twist at the end that it was like, wait, I've listened to this before, and like completely like forgotten.
Yeah, sometimes I do catch myself listening to a podcast again just because I wasn't paying any attention to it the first time. So I totally empathize with you there.
Yeah.
I think I can give you the origin story of the book as well, because like the way it relates to the Hythera series as well, I find is interesting because I'm alternating releases between those two series. They're set obviously in the same world, because I don't know why I'd let all that world building go to waste, right? But they're set about 30 years apart. So Molten Flux happens 30 years before all the events in the Hythera books. But because I'm alternating releases between the two, obviously, I have to try and avoid spoilers, because events in one will affect another. But I feel like I've been able to do some really interesting things about being able to foreshadow stuff between the books as well, or like have extra elements of the plot become apparent in other books entirely. But yeah, the Molten Flux and Blazing Flux, all those books actually spawned because I needed a break from writing the Hythera books. I needed something where I could do all these big battles and all these big fights that the Hythera books just didn't want to hold. So yeah, that's where they came from. That's why I am alternating releases between the two, because when I did get into self-publishing, the Hythera Redux and Molten Flux, they were both ready at the same time, and it seemed like a waste to try and sit on one of them while I finished the other series as well.
Right. No, that makes sense. And like, have you written yourself into a corner yet where like you've done something in the prequel that would change something you did in Hythera Redux, in that first one in there?
Or not yet, thankfully. The first two books are reasonably separate, obviously, because they're already setting up their own stuff. But between the two books and between the other series that I'm planning to release eventually as well, they're all telling this larger story about the kind of buried civilization under the Droughtlands where all these books are set. The people who created Molten Flux and a bunch of other stuff that you really shouldn't be digging up. So in those first two books, there's not a huge amount of interplay, but in the next two books, it starts to become more apparent, like how all these different elements of the world are connected, how they've all had knock-on effects. Because if you look at the world of the Flux catastrophe, how it's all based around all these auto mines and factories and stuff. You see echoes of that 30 years down the track in the Hythera books and the repercussions of everything that happens in the Flux books, even though I haven't technically written that stuff yet. So I've had to do a lot of forward planning to be able to have it all line up properly,
Right.
while at the same time leaving some parts ambiguous enough and some, let's just call them red herrings or temporary red herrings in some of the books that I can pick up later, where something will happen that's a bit unexplained or a bit inexplicable, but it's something that I'm going to pick up like 3 or 4 books down the road, much further in the future.
Right. Wow. That's cool. I find it hard to go back and write prequels after you've already written the series. So maybe
so
the way
hard.
you're doing it might be better, because it's just, you have an idea and then the characters are like, yeah, but what about this?
We're going to do that anyway. And
They're
I
like,
think you're right on that,
you know,
right?
yeah, and it's never like, the what about is like never like something simple. They're like, what about elephants, or like something wild, and you're like,
Yeah.
I don't know, what about the elephants?
Oh,
Like,
let's
where
see,
are
yeah.
they? Like, and
We're going to
like
include everything.
you start following the logic, and then you realize that you've written yourself into a problem because they lead you through all these cool things and you don't see where they're ultimately going to end up, and you're like, oh no, I can't do this because we did this in a book that's set 5 years from now, and that book was published 8 years ago. So
Yeah.
we'd be violating our own like time thing, and
Your own
like,
continuity, yeah.
yeah, that can get really tricky, and characters really don't care. I want to do
they
this.
care at all.
It's fun.
I have got 1 or 2 get out of jail free cards that I've left in there. There's a couple mechanisms that can be used, or not get out of jail free. I think I'll call it a break in case of emergency method if I do end up cooking the continuity. But I am writing the 3rd book of the Flux catastrophe now, which is crazy to do considering the Blazing Flux, the 2nd book, isn't even out yet. But I so far haven't stepped on my own toes there yet, so I'm doing okay.
That's
I think
awesome.
your point about writing prequels, it is hard, right? I think
Yeah.
it's really hard when you're using the same characters between them,
Yep.
because you have a defined fate for them. And like, kind of one of the big things in the world is in this world is certainty, and how that kind of relates to the magic of the world itself, and obviously what the Molten Flux sees in you as well, as a side note. But there are characters that appear between the two books, either one in the future or one in the past, where they're going to survive this. But does that kind of sort of plot armor that kind of the reader sees them as having, how does I like to think about how that reflects on all the other characters in the book around that character? Like, does that make them more vulnerable? Does the reader expect them to die instead, or have something bad happen to them, and that's why they haven't appeared in future books? And I think that's a really interesting way of telling the story as well.
That's true. And it's hard because you're like, I have to save this person because they're in a book 5 years from now, so they can't die in this book. So it sort of limits what you can do in the prequels too, because you have those characters who survive have to survive, and you have to do it in a way that's like believable.
Yeah, I think to build on your point, I think one of the things that a lot of people expect in storytelling, especially in like fantasy, that's this kind of level of lethality where you're expecting characters to either be harmed or be killed or be permanently changed. I feel like there's too much of an expectation that the cost of failure is death when it comes to a character in a fight. I think that that kind of it leaves a character with less kind of options for what their stakes are. I think it's more interesting when the cost of failure isn't death. It's something else, like they could lose something close to them, or they could lose kind of an opportunity to do something in the future, which I won't go into. But I think that it's better to write a story where the stakes aren't death, because death is something we all know and understand as readers. It's not a new kind of concept to us, right? It's something that gets done in every single bit of fantasy. But if the stakes is something interesting, if it's a different kind of loss and it's something new and unique, I think that makes for a more powerful character arc, or at least a more powerful character conflict as well.
And like them surviving that failure could be far worse than death, because they have to live with it.
Exactly. And I think that's just so much more, it gives you so much more depth in the character as well, especially like if they appear in a future book and you see them changed by something but you don't know what failure it was that changed them. It adds kind of another air of mystery to them there too.
That's true. I like that. I think that can be really powerful.
Yeah. Cool. So look, I was just about to type in the private chat, but I can say it here. I've probably only got like another 5 minutes I can stay on for. So
okay.
answer any other questions you have quickly as well. Sorry to have a bit of a tight time schedule.
No. That's totally fine. Like we've already been talking for an hour, and then there was beforehand we talked for a few minutes about
a little bit of chatter, yeah.
Yeah, and then so all right. So when is Blazing Flux coming out?
So Blazing Flux is coming out on April the 2nd. That is 3 days away for me. It might be 4 days for you if you're in America, because it's still Friday for you. But Tuesday, April the 2nd is when it comes out. You'll be able to get it on Amazon Kindle as an ebook. You'll be able to get it from a bunch of other ebook sellers as well, like Apple Books, Google Books, etc. Actually, I need to set up the Google Books really quickly. You'll also be able to get it as a paperback as well. On Amazon or through other online book retailers too. It's a great chunky read. It's got a good looking cover. For those of you watching the video podcast as well, I have custom chapter icons for them too, if they'll show up there.
That's cool.
Some of the weaponry and devices that are used through the books too. So that's a nice bonus there too.
That's pretty awesome. So Blazing Flux is book 2 of X.
Book 2 of the Flux Catastrophe. It is my 4th published work. The other published works I have is the Hythera Redux, which is book 1 of the first Hythera series, which is the kind of parallel series running alongside it. I also have Rising Flux, which is the prequel to these books as well. It's a short novella, which you can get by signing up to my mailing list as well, or you can buy it as a nice, very thin paperback. It was actually quite funny kind of formatting it for a paperback form, because I needed to bulk out the pages a little bit for it as well, just so it had enough page counts in the minimum so I could actually get the text on the spine.
Yeah, that can get really tricky. I know some authors who were just like, forget it, it's too skinny, I can't put the, and if it shifts even a little, it's
awful.
Yeah, and that shift is is something that is unavoidable because of the way print on demand is. But so then what's the next book that you are writing, and when do you anticipate that coming out?
The next book will be the sequel to the Hythera Redux, the second of 5 in that series. That's written. That's currently with my editor as well, so I should be getting that back soon. I anticipate that coming out in August, maybe. Perhaps what's the month after August? September. But I intend to have that out very shortly. That'll have some more elements from Blazing Flux in there too. So I advise reading both series at the same time, because it gives kind of a richer experience. And then after that, I'm looking to have the third Flux Catastrophe book out by the end of the year. So it's really been a crazy wild ride of writing this fast. And I think back to kind of your point about not painting yourself into a corner, the only reason I've been able to avoid that is because all these books have been written in a really short time frame. So it's all still fresh in my head as well.
Yeah, it's hard when you have like years in between. You're like, what happened in there? What's my name again? Who am I?
Yeah, that's
Who are
it.
you?
Like I'm already going through like the other books for references just to make sure I know what a character looks like or what the specific wording of a thing they said is.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's only getting worse because I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with this, but I'm looking at a stack of 4 books on my desk, which I need to go through every time. I need to kind of make sure I've got the continuity right. But I forgot how many books you have at the moment as well. But
24.
Hell for you to go.
Yeah, and I got a new trilogy coming out hopefully in May.
Crikey!
And this one,
so,
it's pulling in all the things. So I'm doing the same thing, but I'm going back through like more books than that.
You must have to like set time aside just to read them all again, right?
That would take forever. So I Google, I searched, I put in things and I just search the documents and because otherwise, and then I'll read the parts that are around the thing that I was looking for. And if I really can't find it through like searching the doc, I will reread it. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
But I end up rereading a lot of it anyways. Just
it's good.
Doing that.
You've written stuff you like. I'm exactly the same as well. It's bad.
Yeah. Cool. That's awesome. So we have the links for his newsletter down below, as well as a link to the books. Thank you so much, Jonathan Weiss. Is there anything else you want to say about Blazing Flux, Hythera Redux, or anything else that we've talked about today, or AI, or creepy images?
No, I just want to say thank you for having me on board, and for anyone listening, I can promise it's a fantastic ride.
Yeah, and don't forget to go back and listen to the episode on the Hythera Redux. I started titling episodes with the name of the book, so we could make it easy to reference when an author was last on here.
Yeah, that's it. That's a good idea.
Yeah, so you should go back and check that out because that was a fun podcast. This one was fun too. They're all fun, but so you can be in on what he's talking about when he references the book. So thank you so much for coming, and you're going to be back in a couple of weeks, maybe.
That's it. Yeah. So I'll be back with the Break-ins. That's the author group I'm a part of. We've been trying to group up like a what's the thing, the robots that all connect together. I forgot what they're called.
Like the Transformers or the Voltron.
The other one. That's it. We're trying to Voltron our way into indie publishing. One of our number actually just met Brandon Sanderson. That was very fun.
Wow.
Even love. So that's pretty impressive. We're getting out there.
That's awesome. Well, we'll hear all about that hopefully soon. That'd be a fun story to hear. But thank you so much for coming on, and we'll talk in a couple of weeks. And thank you all for listening. Have a great day or great night wherever you are, and don't forget to like, subscribe, all the things, so that you get notified when the break-ins come on. When they break in.
Yeah, that's the word for it.